Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The fog hung thick and yellow over Baker Street that November morning in 1891, transforming the familiar thoroughfare into a ghostly procession of half-glimpsed figures and muffled footsteps. From our lodgings at 221B, the gas lamps flickered like pale sentinels through the murk, and the very air seemed to carry the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. It was the sort of weather that invited contemplation, though I little suspected that before the day was through, my dear friend Sherlock Holmes would be presented with one of the most perplexing cases of his remarkable career. Holmes himself sat restlessly in his favourite armchair, his long fingers drumming an irregular tattoo upon the arm as he gazed out into the swirling mist. In one of those moods when the mind, denied a worthy quarry, turns upon itself like a caged predator, he had been attempting to occupy his intellect with a monograph on the chemical properties of various writing inks. The violin lay abandoned upon the table, having already served its purpose as an accompaniment to his restless thoughts. Mrs. Hudson, wise in the ways of her lodger's temperament, had given strict instructions that no casual callers were to be admitted during such periods of intellectual starvation. It was therefore with considerable surprise that we heard the clatter of a hansom cab drawing to an abrupt halt outside, followed by the urgent jangling of the bell in that particular peremptory fashion which unmistakably announced the arrival of Scotland Yard. Inspector Lestrade bounded up the 17 steps 2 at a time, his sharp features bearing the expression of a man who had reached the very limits of his professional capabilities. Holmes had already set aside his papers before the inspector reached our landing, and the two men exchanged that mixture of cordiality and professional rivalry which had grown between them through many a challenging investigation. "If you've come to invite me to breakfast at Scotland Yard, Inspector," said Holmes with characteristic dry humour, "I fear I must decline such hospitality." "If you don't come with me now," returned Lestrade, shooting a quick glance at me, "it will be dinner you'll keep me from, not breakfast. There's a gentleman dead in Bedford Square, and everything about him is as orderly as a church service, except for the manner of his death, which defies every law of nature I thought I understood." Bedford Square was no great distance from our lodgings, and I observed how Holmes's attention, which had been wandering at the edges of ennui, suddenly focused with that characteristic intensity that never failed to quicken my pulse with anticipation. "Well then, Lestrade," said Holmes, drawing the inspector toward the fire with that grave courtesy which never deserted him in the presence of a genuine puzzle, "enlighten us while your cab-horse recovers his wind." Lestrade settled himself into the chair opposite Holmes, brushing moisture from his sleeve, with unnecessary precision as he gathered his thoughts. "You'll have the facts as I received them, Mr. Holmes. At 6:45 this morning, a constable was summoned to number 21, Bedford Square, by the housekeeper of one Mr. Archibald Pelling." "The publisher?" Holmes interjected with interest. "Pelling and Cross. I know the name from half the volumes in London's bookshops." "The very same, a respectable widower of some years, known for his punctual habits and early rising. The household had been astir since shortly after 6, as was their custom, but there had been no movement from the master's study, no lamp visible through the transom. The housekeeper, one Mrs. Broach, grew concerned when repeated knocking brought no response. The door was found to be locked from within, the key still in place. They summoned the nephew, Mr. Lionel Pelling, who resides on the 3rd floor. He attempted to gain entry through the garden windows, but found them similarly secured. "A locked room, then," I observed, feeling that familiar thrill that accompanied the opening moves of one of Holmes's cases. "Indeed, Doctor." A locksmith was called, along with the police. When we finally gained entry at 8 o'clock, we discovered Mr. Pelling seated at his writing desk, his head fallen forward upon his breast, as if he had simply dozed off over his work. The doctor who examined him could find no obvious cause of death, no wounds, no signs of violence or struggle. The room was undisturbed, the gas fire burning steadily. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes beginning to show that particular gleam which indicated his intellectual machinery had begun to engage. And yet you spoke of something that defies natural law. Surely the death of an elderly gentleman at his desk, while tragic, is hardly unprecedented. Ah, but that's where this case takes its peculiar turn, Mr. Holmes. Lestrade's voice dropped to an almost conspiratorial whisper. Upon Mr. Pelling's desk lay a sheet of paper, clearly the document he had been working on at the time of his death. A final letter, it appears, though we cannot determine its contents for the most extraordinary reason. He paused as if gathering courage to voice something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the physical world. The ink upon that paper, Mr. Holmes, refuses to dry. Though the man must have written those words hours ago, the letters remain as wet as if they had been set down mere moments before our arrival. The effect of these words upon Holmes was immediate and pronounced. His entire posture changed, his body becoming as still and focused as a hunting cat that has detected the scent of its prey. Explain yourself more precisely, Inspector. Ink is governed by the same physical laws as any other substance. It must yield to air and time. That is precisely what makes this case so confounding, Lestrade replied, his professional composure barely concealing his bewilderment. By every account, Mr. Pelling was a creature of rigid habit. He would have been at his desk no later than 6 o'clock, possibly earlier. Yet when the doctor attempted to examine the document, the ink smeared beneath his fingers as if it had been applied seconds before. We have tried every remedy we could devise, placing it near the fire, exposing it to draughts, applying blotting paper, but the more we attempt to dry it, the more it seems to resist our efforts. The composition of this ink, Holmes inquired with sharp precision. Was it of the standard variety? A conventional inkstand with 2 wells, Lestrade confirmed, the left containing ordinary blue-black ink, the right a darker formulation. Mr. Pelling's pen had been dipped in the left well, and there were traces of ink upon his fingers and shirt cuff, suggesting he had been writing for some time. Holmes rose and moved to the window, though the fog outside could offer no illumination for the puzzle that had been laid before him. When he spoke again, there was a note of restraint in his voice that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to his most brilliant deductions. You mentioned a nephew. What can you tell us of this Mr. Lionel Pelling? A young man of perhaps 30 years, Mr. Pelling's only surviving relative. He lives in the house and draws an allowance from the business, though he contributes little to its operation beyond signing the occasional document. He claims to have returned from an evening with friends in Bloomsbury shortly after midnight, and states that he heard his uncle moving about in the study at that time. He appeared genuinely distressed when we discovered the body. Were there other documents upon the desk? Several items of business correspondence, proofs for upcoming publications, and a sealed envelope addressed to a Miss Eleanor Vale. The envelope bore yesterday's date and appeared ready for posting. There was also a memorandum with today's date written at the top, and I can assure you, Mr. Holmes, that the ink on these other documents had dried in the normal fashion. Holmes turned from the window, and I could see that curious light in his eyes that indicated some pattern had begun to form in his remarkable mind. Miss Eleanor Vale, an interesting detail. Had this lady visited the house recently? She had called the previous evening, but was not received. Her card was found upon the hall tray. And the household staff? Above reproach, so far as we can determine. Mrs. Broach has been with the family for a decade. There is also a housemaid, a cook, and a footman, all of whom have been questioned. Additionally, there is Mr. Harold Quince, who serves as Mr. Pelling's reader and assistant with proofs and accounts. He arrived at 7 o'clock and was among the first to discover that the study door was locked. Holmes moved toward his coat with that decisive gesture I had witnessed countless times before. "Inspector, if your hansom is still at our disposal, I believe we should examine this miraculous ink for ourselves. The laws of chemistry are not so easily suspended, and I suspect we shall find that human ingenuity, rather than supernatural intervention, lies at the heart of this mystery." As we prepared to depart for Bedford Square, I found myself contemplating the central impossibility that had been presented to us. Ink that would not dry seemed to violate the most fundamental principles of physics, yet I had learned through long association with Holmes that the most apparently impossible circumstances often yielded to logical analysis when examined by a mind capable of perceiving the connections that eluded ordinary observation. The fog seemed to part before our hansom as we made our way through the London streets, and I could not shake the feeling that we were being drawn into a web of deception far more complex than the simple locked room mystery it appeared to be on the surface. The image of that perpetually wet ink haunted my imagination, suggesting secrets that time itself seemed reluctant to reveal. The hansom set us down before number 21 Bedford Square within the half hour, the fog beginning to lift sufficiently to reveal the elegant Georgian facade in all its morning dignity. The house stood distinguished among its neighbours by the unmistakable signs of official attention. A constable stationed at the front steps, the brass door-knocker bearing the dull patina of recent and frequent use, and that subtle air of disturbance which always seemed to emanate from a dwelling touched by sudden death. Mrs. Broach, the housekeeper, received us in the front hall with that particular combination of grief and professional composure that marked her as a woman accustomed to maintaining household order regardless of circumstances. She was perhaps 50 years of age, her iron-grey hair arranged with mathematical precision, her black dress bearing not a single wrinkle despite the morning's extraordinary events. Her hands, however, trembled slightly as she gestured toward the staircase, and I detected the faint trace of a Yorkshire accent when she spoke. "Mr. Pelling's study is on the first floor, gentlemen," she informed us. "Nothing has been disturbed since the inspector's examination, save for the removal of the master's body to the morning room. The study remains exactly as we found it." Holmes paused at the foot of the stairs, his attention caught by some detail that had escaped both Lestrade's notice and my own. "Mrs. Broach, you mentioned that your master was a man of regular habits. At what time would he typically retire for the evening?" "Precisely at 10:30, sir, after taking a glass of warm milk in the library. He would extinguish the gas lamps himself and ensure that all doors were properly secured. In 15 years of service, I cannot recall a single deviation from this routine. And yet, Mr. Lionel Pelling reported hearing movement in the study. Well past midnight." The housekeeper's expression grew troubled. "That is what Master Lionel claimed, sir, though I confess it strikes me as most unusual. The study is directly below my own quarters, and I am a light sleeper. I heard nothing after the master's customary retirement." The study door stood slightly ajar, its brass handle bearing the scratches that testified to the locksmith's forcible entry. As we crossed the threshold, I was immediately struck by the profound stillness that seemed to permeate the room. The study opened upon us like a perfectly preserved tableau. Floor-to-ceiling bookcases lined 3 walls, a gas fire glowed steadily in the grate, and tall windows offered a view of the square's central garden, though the morning light filtered through them with a peculiar, muted quality. The infamous sheet of paper lay precisely where Lestrade had described, positioned directly before the chair where Mr. Pelling had drawn his final breath. Holmes approached it with the careful deliberation of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation, producing his magnifying glass and bending low over the document. "Remarkable," he murmured. And indeed it was true. The writing shone wetly in the firelight, appearing as fresh as if it had been applied moments before our arrival. Holmes drew a fresh slip from a drawer, dipped the pen into the left-hand inkwell, and wrote a brief word. It dried with perfect docility within moments. "There is nothing miraculous in ink," Holmes observed, more to himself than to us. "When it misbehaves, the reason usually lies elsewhere." He examined the arrangement of items upon the desk with that characteristic intensity, and I observed his eyes narrow as he noted something significant. "Inspector, observe the position of the inkwell. It sits approximately 18 inches to the right of the document. Yet for a right-handed man, which his penmanship clearly indicates he was, this positioning would require an awkward reaching motion with each dip of the pen." I immediately grasped the significance of his observation. "The inkwell has been moved." "Precisely, Watson. Furthermore, note the blotter beneath the document. It bears no trace of the excessive ink that would naturally result from such persistently wet writing." Holmes moved closer to the inkwell, his keen eyes detecting a thin, almost imperceptible ring of moisture that encircled its base. At that moment, footsteps approached in the corridor, and Mrs. Broach announced, "Mr. Lionel Pelling wishes to speak with you, gentlemen." The nephew entered, a personable figure of perhaps 30 years, whose eyes were red with wakefulness, and whose obvious grief struggled with an undercurrent of nervous agitation. Holmes regarded him with that particular attention he reserved for individuals who might prove central to his investigations. "You heard your uncle moving about the study after midnight?" Holmes inquired without preamble. "I did, sir, though I confess it struck me as unusual given his regular habits." Holmes's grey eyes glinted with that familiar light that indicated some pattern had begun to form in his remarkable mind. The mystery of the undrying ink had taken on new dimensions, and I sensed we were only beginning to glimpse the true complexity of the puzzle that lay before us. Lionel Pelling possessed that particular restless energy which often accompanies a guilty conscience, his hands moving constantly as he spoke, adjusting his cuffs, smoothing his hair, fingering the watch chain that stretched across his waistcoat. His gaze rarely settled upon any one object for more than a moment, and when Holmes's penetrating stare fell upon him, the young man seemed to shrink within his clothes. "The sounds were quite distinct, Mr. Holmes," he continued, his voice carrying the educated accent of a gentleman, though lacking the authority that typically accompanies such breeding. A chair being moved, papers rustling, the occasional creak of floorboards. I assumed Uncle Archibald had been unable to sleep and had returned to his work, as he sometimes did when troubled by business matters. Holmes had positioned himself near the fireplace, where he could observe both the nephew's demeanour and the mysterious document that lay upon the desk. "You did not think to investigate these unusual sounds?" I confess I considered it, but Uncle Archibald valued his privacy above all things. Besides, I had returned rather late myself from the Garrick Club and was not entirely... That is, I had enjoyed a convivial evening and thought it best not to intrude upon his solitude. The admission of intoxication, delivered with obvious embarrassment, struck me as either remarkably candid or carefully calculated to explain any inconsistencies in his account. Holmes, however, seemed less interested in the young man's evening activities than in the precise scientific nature of the mystery before us. "Watson, your medical bag, if you please. I require a clean glass slide." I produced the requested item, watching as Holmes, with meticulous care, touched the corner of a blotter to the edge of a still wet letter, then transferred the almost invisible trace to the slide. He examined it under his powerful magnifying glass for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Most interesting," he murmured, producing a tiny glass rod from his waistcoat pocket. He moistened the tip at the water carafe upon the side table and touched it so lightly that the paper scarcely stirred, to the lower loop of a capital letter. At once the line feathered into a soft, inky bloom, and Holmes's nostrils dilated as he leaned closer. "Sweet," he announced, turning to me. "Do you detect it, Watson? A faint saccharine note. Not the harsh spirit of ether or the metallic tang of ordinary ink, but something distinctly organic." I bent cautiously and inhaled. A sweetness, yes. Could it be glycerin? Precisely what I suspected. Holmes returned, his eyes going to the inkwell's base with something approaching satisfaction. "Observe this ring, Watson. Viscid, almost imperceptible, unless one catches the light at a slant. A humectant has been employed upon the surface of this sheet, rendering it resistant to natural drying. The ink will remain wet indefinitely, a hostage to the artificially maintained atmosphere." At that moment, footsteps approached in the corridor, and a thin young man with thoughtful eyes behind steel-rimmed spectacles appeared in the doorway, carrying a ledger pressed against his chest. "Begging pardon," he said in a soft voice. "I am Harold Quince, Mr. Pelling's reader and assistant. Mrs. Broach suggested I might be of service." "Indeed, Mr. Quince," Holmes replied pleasantly. "You are familiar with your employer's working habits. Would he ever write upon a prepared sheet, anything treated with varnish or glycerin?" Quince's brow furrowed in genuine puzzlement. "Never, sir. He used good wove paper, but nothing of that sort. He was precise, almost fastidious about his materials. He abhorred smudges above all things." "And yet we have a page that behaves like a child's slate," Holmes observed. "When did you last see Mr. Pelling alive?" "Yesterday evening, at 7:30. We dined together at Simpson's on the Strand. A working dinner to review the final proofs of a rather controversial memoir. We parted company at 9 o'clock, and he mentioned his intention to retire early." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "A controversial memoir, you say?" "Anonymously authored, but I suspect it concerns certain political figures. Mr. Pelling was somewhat apprehensive about its publication, given the sensitive nature of the revelations contained within." Before Holmes could pursue this intriguing development further, the housemaid appeared at the door, her knuckles white as she clutched a small leather-bound volume. "Excuse me, sir," she stammered to Lestrade, "but Mr. Quince asked me to bring Mr. Pelling's appointment diary from yesterday." Holmes took the diary with evident interest, opening it to the previous day's entries. "Most illuminating," he murmured, scanning the neatly penned schedule. "November 8th, 10 o'clock. Meeting with Mr. Cross, 2:30, reviewing Miss Thorne's proofs, 4 o'clock tea with Miss Eleanor Vale, and 7 o'clock dinner with Mr. Quince." He looked up sharply at Lionel. "No mention of late-night work in the study, Mr. Pelling. No sudden inspiration to pen urgent correspondence." The effect upon Lionel was immediate and pronounced. His restless movements ceased entirely, and his face assumed the careful blankness of a man attempting to conceal strong emotion. He must have forgotten to record it. Uncle Archibald was often absent-minded when deeply engrossed in a project. "Or perhaps," Holmes countered, his grey eyes taking on that steely quality which I had learned to associate with the crystallization of his suspicions, he did not work in the study at all after his return from dinner, which raises the fascinating question of who did prepare this chemically treated document, and when, and most importantly, why they wished to create the illusion that your uncle's final words were written at the moment of his death. The implication hung heavy in the air, like the morning fog that still clung to the windows. Lionel Pelling's face had grown pale, and I observed his hands trembling slightly as the full weight of Holmes's deduction settled upon the room. The mystery of the undrying ink had transformed from a scientific curiosity into something far more sinister, evidence of deliberate deception designed to obscure the true circumstances of Archibald Pelling's final hours. Furthermore, Holmes continued relentlessly, you alone reported hearing sounds from this room after midnight, sounds that went undetected by Mrs. Broach, whose quarters lie directly above and who admits to being a light sleeper. The glycerin treatment of this document required careful preparation and precise timing, knowledge of chemistry, and access to materials not commonly found in a publisher's study. It was at this crucial moment that Mrs. Broach appeared once more in the doorway, her expression bearing considerable agitation. "Forgive the interruption, gentlemen, but there is a lady below who insists upon seeing someone in authority regarding Mr. Pelling's death. She says her name is Miss Eleanor Vale, and she appears most distressed." The timing of this arrival struck me as remarkably significant, and I observed Holmes's expression suggest he found it less surprising than providential. The various threads of our investigation were beginning to converge with that inexorable logic that characterized his most brilliant cases, and I sensed we were approaching one of those crucial moments when the true nature of the puzzle would begin to reveal itself in all its complex and carefully orchestrated deception. Miss Eleanor Vale entered the morning room with that particular composure which grief assumes when it has been too long sustained to permit the luxury of tears. She was a woman of perhaps 35 years, possessed of refined features that bore the subtle marks of genteel poverty. Her dark travelling dress was well cut, but showed signs of careful maintenance, and her gloved hands, though steady, betrayed the slight tremor of barely controlled emotion. Her intelligent eyes, though reddened from recent weeping, held a determination that immediately commanded Holmes's respectful attention. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the cultured accent of education without the assurance of wealth, "I have come from Dorsetshire on the earliest train upon hearing the dreadful news. I must know the circumstances of Mr. Pelling's death, for I fear I may bear some responsibility for the tragedy that has befallen him." This extraordinary admission produced an immediate effect upon our small assembly. Lestrade straightened with obvious interest, while Holmes assumed that attitude of watchful stillness which indicated his complete attention had been engaged. Even Lionel Pelling, who had been hovering near the doorway with increasing agitation, stepped forward with evident concern. "In what manner do you consider yourself responsible, Miss Vale?" Holmes inquired with that gentle courtesy he invariably employed when questioning persons in genuine distress. Mr. Pelling had written to me 3 weeks ago with an urgent request to examine certain papers that had belonged to my late father. My father was a physician in Dorsetshire for nearly 30 years, and his medical records were remarkably complete and detailed. Mr. Pelling offered a substantial sum for the use of these documents in preparing a memoir, an anonymous account of a prominent political figure's private struggles with a chronic ailment that had significantly influenced his public career. She paused, withdrawing a delicate handkerchief from her reticule and pressing it briefly to her eyes. When I arrived yesterday afternoon, however, Mr. Pelling seemed greatly agitated. He spoke of dangerous revelations, of persons who would stop at nothing to prevent certain information from becoming public knowledge. He had received threatening correspondence, he said, and feared that forces beyond our control were moving to suppress the memoir entirely. Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "These threatening letters, Miss Vale, did Mr. Pelling show them to you?" "He did not, but he spoke of them with considerable anxiety. He mentioned parliamentary interests and suggested that someone close to the project had betrayed his confidence. He seemed torn between proceeding with the publication and abandoning it entirely despite the considerable financial investment he had already made. And what was your response to his concerns? I told him that if there was genuine danger, we should delay publication until we could be certain of our position. He agreed and said he would prepare a formal document outlining our decision, either to proceed or to abandon the project entirely. He insisted that everything should be properly documented and witnessed. At this point, Holmes rose and moved toward the study door. Miss Vale, I believe you should examine a document we discovered upon Mr. Pelling's desk. It appears to be the letter he was preparing at the time of his death. We returned to the study, where the mysterious sheet still lay with its persistently wet ink gleaming in the firelight. Miss Vale approached it with obvious reluctance, bending to examine the writing with growing bewilderment and horror. "This is most extraordinary," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The handwriting is certainly Mr. Pelling's, but the content—" She looked up at Holmes with genuine shock. "This purports to be a confession of fraud. It claims that my father's medical records were forgeries created to damage an innocent man's reputation, and that I conspired with him in this deception for financial gain. The implications of this revelation struck me with considerable force. If genuine, such a document would not only destroy Miss Vale's reputation, but would provide a convenient explanation for Mr. Pelling's death, the suicide of a man overcome by guilt at his participation in a fraudulent scheme." "Miss Vale," Holmes continued with careful precision, "I must ask you to state categorically, are your father's medical records authentic?" "Absolutely authentic," she replied with conviction that rang with sincerity. "My father was scrupulously honest in all his professional dealings. His notes were meticulously maintained and have never been altered in any fashion. This confession is a complete fabrication." "Then we are faced with a most interesting situation," Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction which always accompanied his most brilliant deductions. "Someone has gone to considerable trouble to create a false confession, employing chemical means to suggest it was written at the moment of death, when in fact it must have been prepared well in advance of Mr. Pelling's demise." Harold Quince, who had been listening with growing agitation, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Holmes, there is something I fear I must reveal. Yesterday evening, after our dinner, Mr. Pelling confided that he had received a visit from a gentleman claiming to represent certain political interests. This person had made it clear that the memoir's publication would result in serious consequences for all involved." "Did he describe this visitor?" Holmes inquired sharply. "Only that he was well-dressed, spoke with authority, and possessed detailed knowledge of the memoir's contents. Mr. Pelling was convinced that someone with intimate knowledge of the project had betrayed his confidence." Quince's eyes moved, almost involuntarily, toward Lionel Pelling. Holmes had moved to the study door and was examining the lock mechanism with minute attention. "The question of betrayal is indeed central to our investigation," he murmured, producing a thin strip of steel and a length of silk thread from his waistcoat pocket. "Observe, gentlemen, how readily this door may be secured from without." With practiced efficiency, he demonstrated how the silk could be passed beneath the door, looped through the key's bow, and used to turn the lock from the corridor. "Elementary mechanics," he observed. "With patience and practice, one may secure from without any door whose key remains conveniently within." The demonstration had a profound effect upon our assembled company. Lestrade's eyes brightened with understanding, while Lionel Pelling's face had grown noticeably pale. Miss Vale watched with fascination, mixed with growing comprehension of the deception that had been practiced. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, If someone has gone to such elaborate lengths to create false evidence and manufacture a confession, then Mr. Pelling's death was no natural occurrence. Someone with access to this house, knowledge of chemical processes, and intimate familiarity with the memoir project has committed murder and attempted to disguise it as suicide accompanied by a convenient admission of fraud. Holmes nodded approvingly. Precisely, Miss Vale. We are dealing with a mind of considerable cunning, one that understood not only the necessity of eliminating Mr. Pelling, but also the importance of discrediting the memoir project entirely. The false confession serves both purposes admirably, provided one accepts the miraculous nature of ink that refuses to dry. As we prepared to leave the study, I observed Holmes's grey eyes fix upon Lionel Pelling, with that penetrating intensity that had unravelled so many carefully constructed deceptions. The young man's nervous agitation had increased markedly during our investigation, and I sensed that Holmes had begun to perceive the pattern of guilt and calculation that lay beneath his facade of grief. The web of evidence was drawing tighter, and I felt certain that before many more hours had passed, the true nature of this elaborate crime would be revealed in all its calculated malevolence. The revelation of the false confession had transformed our investigation entirely, and Holmes wasted no time in pursuing the implications of this elaborate deception. He requested immediately to examine Mr. Pelling's remains, which had been arranged with respectful dignity in the morning room. There, beneath a sheet of fine lawn, lay the publisher in that profound stillness which death alone can bestow, his features bearing an almost judicial gravity in their final repose. Holmes approached the examination with that methodical precision which characterized all his investigations, drawing the sheet down to reveal the deceased's face and throat. He bent low over the still form, his keen nostrils dilating as he inhaled with careful attention. After a moment's consideration, he straightened and turned to me with that expression of quiet satisfaction which indicated a significant discovery. "Watson, your medical expertise would be invaluable here. Do you detect any unusual odor about the person?" I leaned closer, employing the diagnostic skills of my profession, and indeed perceived a faint but distinctive sweetness that seemed to hover about the deceased's lips and clothing. Something organic, certainly, not the harshness of spirits, nor the distinctive character of laudanum. "Precisely," Holmes murmured, producing his magnifying glass to examine the fountain pen that had been removed from the study desk. "Observe the nib, Watson. Note this faint bluish discoloration at the root of the steel point." He touched the suspicious area with a dampened corner of his handkerchief, producing an almost imperceptible trace of colour. "The reaction of iron with a cyanogen compound, prussic acid, unless I am much mistaken. The implication struck me with considerable force. You suspect poisoning. The evidence suggests it strongly. The sweet odour of bitter almonds, the chemical reaction upon the pen. Someone has employed prussic acid with considerable skill and knowledge." Holmes turned his penetrating gaze upon Harold Quince, who had grown noticeably pale during this examination. "Mr. Quince, you mentioned familiarity with photographic processes. Such work would require knowledge of various chemical compounds, would it not?" Quince nodded reluctantly. "Indeed, sir. Potassium cyanide is employed as a photographic fixer, though in carefully controlled quantities. I learned the processes at university, though I have not practiced in recent years." "Yet you would recognize the distinctive characteristics of such compounds." "Certainly, Mr. Holmes. The almond-like odour is unmistakable to those familiar with the substance." Holmes had moved to examine Mr. Pelling's private writing desk in the corner of the morning room, where he discovered a leather-bound blotter that immediately captured his attention. "Most illuminating," he announced, holding the blotter to the light to reveal the faint impressions of reversed handwriting pressed through from above. With delicate precision, he began shading the surface with a soft graphite pencil, gradually revealing the hidden text. The impressions read, Holmes announced with evident satisfaction, My dear Eleanor, I fear our project has attracted dangerous attention. I have decided to suspend publication indefinitely and return your father's papers immediately. The risks have become too great to justify continuation. Miss Vale stepped forward with obvious emotion. That corresponds exactly with his stated intentions during our meeting yesterday. He was genuinely concerned for our safety and had decided to abandon the memoir entirely. Note particularly, Holmes continued, that these impressions bear yesterday's date and were written with ordinary ink that dried in the conventional manner. This represents Mr. Pelling's genuine final correspondence, composed here in his private chamber, not in the study where his body was discovered. At this moment, Mrs. Broach appeared in the doorway, with evident agitation. Forgive the interruption, gentlemen, but I have remembered something that may prove significant. Last evening, after Mr. Pelling had retired, I heard the front door open and close. When I investigated, I found a calling card upon the hall tray from a Mr. Horace Clay, Member of Parliament. There had been an envelope with it, but this morning, both the envelope and its contents had disappeared. Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. Mr. Clay called after your master had retired. The footman received him at 10:30, sir. The gentleman insisted his business was urgent, but would not disturb the master. He left the sealed envelope with strict instructions that it be delivered first thing in the morning. And this envelope has vanished? Lionel Pelling, who had been hovering near the doorway with increasing agitation, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. I may have seen such an envelope on the hall tray when I returned from my evening out. I thought nothing of it at the time. Holmes fixed the young man with that penetrating stare which had unravelled so many carefully constructed deceptions. You saw the envelope but took no action regarding it. I assumed it would be dealt with in the usual manner, Lionel replied, though his voice carried a tremor that suggested considerable anxiety. Uncle Archibald received many urgent communications. Yet this particular communication has disappeared entirely, leaving only the calling card as evidence of Mr. Clay's visit. Holmes paused, allowing the implications to settle upon our small assembly. We are faced with a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication. Someone with intimate knowledge of this household, access to chemical compounds, skill in forgery, and the ability to manipulate both physical evidence and official correspondence. The net of evidence was drawing ever tighter around our suspects, and I observed Lionel Pelling's face assume an expression of barely concealed panic as Holmes's deductions revealed the true complexity of the crime that had been committed. The atmosphere in the morning room had grown increasingly charged with unspoken tensions, and Holmes wasted no time in pursuing the implications of the vanished correspondence. At his request, the footman was summoned, a steady young man of perhaps 25 years, with the clear eyes and honest bearing that marked him as a reliable witness, despite his obvious anxiety at finding himself central to such grave proceedings. You received Mr. Clay at 10:30 last evening? Holmes inquired without preamble, his penetrating gaze fixed upon the servant with that intensity which commanded absolute truthfulness. Yes, sir, the footman replied, his voice steady despite his evident nervousness. He arrived alone in a private brougham and insisted his business would not brook delay. He would not disturb the master who had retired, but left a sealed envelope with strict instructions for early delivery. The paper was of superior quality, cream-coloured and thick, with what appeared to be a green silk thread beneath the wax seal. Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. You observed the seal closely? Indeed, sir. The wax was dark red, bearing a crest that appeared to show a hand grasping a laurel spray with the initials HC clearly impressed. The gentleman was most particular that it reach Mr. Pelling first thing in the morning. And after this visitor departed, what became of the envelope? I placed it upon the hall tray with the other correspondence, sir. I then returned to the servants' hall to complete my evening duties. At perhaps midnight, Mr. Lionel returned from his evening out. He appeared somewhat, that is, he had clearly enjoyed a convivial time. He requested a glass of water and stood for several minutes near the hall tray, examining the post. When I returned with his refreshment, he thanked me and retired to his chambers. The implications of this testimony struck me with considerable force, and I observed Holmes's grey eyes narrow with that particular intensity which marked a significant development in his reasoning. Mrs. Broach stepped forward with obvious distress, her hands clasped tightly before her. "In the morning, sir, when I prepared the breakfast tray, the envelope was no longer among the correspondence. I thought perhaps the master had collected it himself during one of his early morning walks about the house. But now—" Her voice trailed off as the sinister implications became clear. Holmes rose and moved purposefully toward the study, where he knelt before the fireplace with the careful precision of a surgeon. Using the brass tongs, he began a methodical examination of the uppermost layer of ash, his keen eyes detecting patterns invisible to ordinary observation. After several minutes of delicate excavation, he produced a brittle crescent of dark red wax, partially melted, but still bearing the faint impression of a heraldic device. "Observe, Watson," he announced with quiet satisfaction, holding the fragment to the light. A laurel spray and 2 letters still legible at the edge, H and C, precisely as our witness described. He continued his careful search and retrieved a charred fragment of heavy paper whose inner fibres retained traces of green silk thread. "The house has obligingly disposed of Mr. Clay's communication, though not completely enough to escape scientific examination." At that moment, rapid footsteps approached in the corridor, and Lestrade appeared with a telegram clutched in his hand. "Mr. Holmes, I've received word from Westminster. Mr. Horace Clay, Member of Parliament, has been located at his club, where he spent the entire evening in the company of several colleagues. He vehemently denies having visited Bedford Square or having sent any communication to Mr. Pelling." The effect of this revelation upon our small assembly was immediate and profound. Miss Vale stepped forward with obvious bewilderment, while Harold Quince's face assumed an expression of growing comprehension. Only Lionel Pelling remained frozen in apparent shock, his face draining of all colour as the implications became clear. "Then we are faced with a most interesting development," Holmes observed, his voice carrying that note of intellectual satisfaction which accompanied his most brilliant deductions. "Someone has employed Mr. Clay's identity for purposes of deception, knowing full well that such impersonation would eventually be discovered and would serve to muddy the investigative waters." He moved to examine the pen wiper upon the desk, pressing it delicately to his nostrils before offering it to me for inspection. Beneath the ordinary odours of ink and dust, I detected that same faint sweetness we had encountered upon the mysterious document and about the person of the deceased. "The pattern becomes increasingly clear," Holmes continued, his penetrating gaze moving from one member of our assembly to another. "Someone with intimate knowledge of this household, access to chemical compounds, and detailed familiarity with Mr. Pelling's business affairs has orchestrated an elaborate deception. The false identity, the vanished correspondence, the chemically treated confession, all serve to create a web of misdirection designed to obscure the true nature of the crime. Lionel Pelling had grown visibly agitated during this exposition, his hands trembling as he struggled to maintain his composure under Holmes's relentless analysis. The young man's nervous energy, which had seemed merely the natural result of grief and shock, now appeared in a far more sinister light as the evidence accumulated against him. "Mr. Pelling," Holmes addressed the nephew with that deceptive mildness which often preceded his most devastating revelations, "you claim to have heard your uncle working in the study after midnight. Yet we now know that he had retired at his customary hour and had already composed his genuine final letter in his private chambers. Perhaps you could clarify the exact nature of these sounds you reported?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over the young man's head, and I observed his face assume that expression of trapped desperation which marks the moment when carefully constructed lies begin to collapse under the weight of inexorable logic. The web of evidence was drawing ever tighter, and I sensed that Holmes was preparing to spring the trap that would finally expose the true architect of this elaborate and murderous deception. Lionel Pelling's response to Holmes's pointed inquiry came with all the hesitation of a man whose carefully constructed deceptions were beginning to crumble under relentless scrutiny. His hands, which had been restless throughout our investigation, now trembled visibly as he struggled to maintain the facade of innocent grief that had served him thus far. "The sounds were quite distinct, Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice carrying a tremor that had not been present in his earlier testimony. "Perhaps I was mistaken about the precise time, given the convivial nature of my evening, but I am certain I heard movement from the study area, the scratch of a pen, papers being shuffled, the creak of the floorboards." Holmes had positioned himself near the window, where the strengthening morning light illuminated his sharp features with almost judicial clarity. When he spoke, his voice carried that deceptive mildness which I had learned to recognize as the precursor to his most devastating revelations. "Mr. Pelling, you mentioned returning from the Garrick Club at midnight. I took the liberty of sending a wire to the club secretary earlier this morning. According to their records, you departed at 9:30, not midnight as you claimed. This discrepancy of 2.5 hours becomes rather significant when we consider the precise timing of events in this household." The effect upon Lionel was immediate and devastating. His carefully maintained composure cracked visibly, and he sank into the nearest chair with the deflated appearance of a man whose elaborate construction of lies had finally begun to collapse beneath its own weight. Mrs. Broach stepped forward with obvious distress, her loyalty to the household warring with her growing comprehension of the terrible implications. "Furthermore," Holmes continued with relentless precision, "your claim of intoxication serves a dual purpose. It explains any inconsistencies in your testimony, while providing justification for your supposed confusion about timing. However, the footman's observation suggests you were quite lucid when you examined the correspondence upon the hall tray at midnight. midnight. Harold Quince, who had been growing increasingly pale during this exchange, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Holmes, I fear there is something else I must reveal. Yesterday afternoon, when I arrived for my usual duties, I discovered that someone had been examining Mr. Pelling's private correspondence files. Several folders had been disturbed, and there were traces of sealing wax upon surfaces where none should have been." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "You suspected document manipulation?" "The thought crossed my mind, sir, particularly given Mr. Pelling's recent concerns about betrayal within our circle. However, I assumed it was merely his own increased caution regarding the memoir project." Quince paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I should also mention that my background includes advanced study in photographic chemistry at Cambridge. I am quite familiar with the properties of various chemical compounds, including those that might be employed to prevent ink from drying naturally. The implications of this admission struck our small assembly with considerable force. Here was a man with both the knowledge and opportunity to create the chemically treated document that had so puzzled our investigation. Yet something in his manner, the genuine distress, the reluctant honesty of his confession, suggested a complexity that extended beyond simple guilt. Holmes moved to examine a leather portfolio that had been partially concealed beneath other papers on the desk. As he opened it, his eyebrows rose with evident satisfaction. "Most illuminating," he murmured, withdrawing a series of photographic plates that appeared to show documents in various stages of reproduction. It would seem that someone has been practicing the art of document forgery with considerable dedication. Miss Vale, who had been following these revelations with growing horror, now spoke with quiet determination. "Mr. Holmes, if we are dealing with systematic deception involving both timeline manipulation and document forgery, then we must consider that multiple parties may be involved in this conspiracy." "Indeed, Miss Vale, the evidence suggests a carefully orchestrated sequence of events, but whether conceived by one mind or representing a collaboration remains to be determined." Holmes fixed both Lionel and Quince with that penetrating stare which had unravelled so many criminal conspiracies. The question that now presents itself is not merely who possessed the knowledge and opportunity to commit this crime, but who possessed sufficient motive to justify such elaborate planning and execution. At this crucial moment, Lestrade returned with a telegram clutched in his hand. "Mr. Holmes, the chemical analysis has been completed. The laboratory confirms that the glycerin compound requires specialized knowledge to prepare, specifically training in photographic chemistry. They estimate it would take considerable practice to achieve the precise formulation we discovered." The tension in the room had become almost palpable, and I observed both Quince and Lionel watching each other with expressions that suggested a complex web of mutual suspicion and shared secrets. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to illuminate not merely the physical evidence of the crime, but the psychological landscape of deception and betrayal that had led to Archibald Pelling's death. Holmes had begun that restless pacing which indicated his remarkable mind was working to assemble the various elements into a coherent pattern. "We are dealing with a conspiracy of considerable sophistication," he announced. "Someone with intimate knowledge of this household, access to specialized materials, skill in document reproduction, and detailed familiarity with the memoir project has orchestrated Mr. Pelling's death, while simultaneously attempting to discredit the very work that may have motivated the crime." He paused before the fireplace, his keen eyes moving from one suspect to another. The false confession, the chemically treated paper, the forged correspondence from Mr. Clay, the manipulation of physical evidence, all serve to create a web of misdirection designed to obscure the true nature of what has occurred in this house. But criminals, however clever, invariably leave traces of their passage, and those traces are beginning to form a pattern that will ultimately lead us to the truth. As Holmes prepared to pursue the next phase of his investigation, I could see that the net of evidence was drawing ever tighter around our suspects. The morning's revelations had transformed what appeared to be a simple, locked-room mystery into something far more complex and sinister, a carefully planned murder disguised as natural death executed by individuals whose motives remained partially concealed, but whose methods were becoming increasingly clear under Holmes's relentless analysis. The psychological pressure in the morning room had reached a crescendo, and Holmes, with that characteristic decisiveness which marked his most brilliant investigations, chose this moment to shift the field of inquiry. Rather than allow the tension to dissipate in further protestations of innocence, He turned to Lestrade with the air of a general repositioning his forces. "Inspector, I believe we have extracted all that Bedford Square can yield for the present. The true heart of this conspiracy lies not in domestic arrangements, but in the professional apparatus that made such elaborate deception possible." He fixed both Quince and Lionel with that penetrating stare which had unravelled so many carefully constructed lies. "Gentlemen, you will accompany us to the offices of Pelling and Cross. I suspect we shall find there the workshop where this chemical artistry was perfected." The publishing house on Fleet Street received us beneath a sky that had brightened to pale silver, though the morning retained that peculiar quality of muted light which seemed appropriate to our grim investigation. The building itself bore the dignified shabbiness of established commerce, narrow windows begrimed with years of London soot, and the persistent odour of ink and hot metal that marked the premises of the printing trade. Mr. Basil Cross awaited us in his private office, a spare man whose ascetic features bore the unmistakable marks of professional anxiety. His greeting carried the wary courtesy of one who had already received unwelcome news, and his pale eyes measured each member of our party with obvious calculation. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, "I fear our troubles extend beyond my partner's tragic death. We discovered this morning that someone had forced entry to Mr. Pelling's private office during the night. The safe was opened with considerable skill, and several specific items were removed with what appears to be deliberate selection." Holmes moved immediately to examine the violated safe, his keen eyes noting the precision with which the lock had been manipulated. "Professional work," he murmured, running his fingers along the smooth edges of the forced mechanism. "What exactly was taken, Mr. Cross?" "3 items of particular significance," Cross replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A set of electrotype plates bearing our house crest, a compositor's record book containing dates and signatures for recent work, and most disturbing of all, the advance proofs of a public statement we had been preparing regarding the memoir's cancellation." Holmes straightened with evident interest. "A public statement in whose name?" "Mr. Pelling's, naturally, though I must confess the document struck me as unusually harsh in its denunciation of Miss Vale's materials. My partner had seemed to waver in his commitment to such strong language, particularly after his meeting with the lady yesterday." At this revelation, Holmes moved to examine Pelling's desk with that methodical precision which characterized all his investigations. The leather blotter immediately captured his attention, and he held it to the light with obvious satisfaction. "Observe, Watson," he announced, indicating a faint, greasy sheen along the edges of recent impressions. "Our friend Glycerin has left its signature here as well. Someone has been practicing their chemical artistry in this very room." Harold Quince, who had grown increasingly pale during this examination, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Holmes, I must confess that I have occasionally used this office for photographic work. Mr. Pelling was kind enough to allow me access to the darkroom facilities in the basement for my personal projects. I have the necessary chemicals and equipment to produce the effects you describe." "Indeed, Mr. Quince? And your university training would have provided the theoretical foundation for such specialized applications?" Holmes's voice carried that deceptive mildness which often preceded his most devastating revelations. "Cambridge included advanced courses in photographic chemistry," Quince admitted, his scholarly composure beginning to crack under the weight of implication. "I am familiar with various humectants and their properties, including compounds that might be used to prevent the natural drying of ink. However, I must emphasize that such knowledge was acquired for legitimate scientific purposes." Holmes had begun that restless pacing which indicated his remarkable mind was assembling the various elements into a coherent pattern. "The beauty of this deception," he observed, lies not merely in its chemical sophistication, but in its psychological cunning. By creating a confession that appeared to be written at the moment of death, the perpetrator sought to establish both motive and timeline while simultaneously discrediting the very work that may have motivated the crime. He paused before the window, his grey eyes taking on that particular intensity which marked the crystallization of his suspicions. Yet the scheme required not only chemical knowledge but intimate familiarity with Mr. Pelling's habits, access to his private papers, and the ability to manipulate both household routines and business correspondence. Such a combination of capabilities suggests either remarkable versatility in a single individual or careful coordination between multiple parties. At this crucial moment, a breathless messenger arrived with news that transformed our investigation entirely. Miss Vale's hotel room had been burglarized, her father's medical records scattered and examined, though apparently nothing had been taken. The intruder had fled when discovered, but not before demonstrating the same professional skill and specific purpose that had characterized the break-in at the publishing house. "Our adversary grows desperate," Holmes observed, with evident satisfaction. "The systematic destruction of evidence, the attempted theft of corroborating materials, the escalating risks taken in broad daylight all suggest that someone fears the truth is drawing dangerously near to exposure." He turned to address our assembled company with that quiet authority which commanded absolute attention. "We are dealing with a mind of considerable cunning, one that understood not only the necessity of eliminating Mr. Pelling, but also the importance of creating a false narrative that would satisfy official inquiry and prevent further investigation. The chemical deception, the forged correspondence, the manipulation of physical evidence all serve to obscure the true sequence of events while providing convenient explanations for any inconsistencies that might arise." As Holmes prepared to reveal the next phase of his investigation, I observed the faces of our suspects with growing fascination. Lionel Pelling's nervous agitation had intensified markedly, while Harold Quince's scholarly composure showed increasing signs of strain. The morning's revelations had transformed what appeared to be a simple domestic tragedy into something far more complex and sinister, a carefully orchestrated murder designed to serve multiple purposes while concealing the true motives of its architect. The web of evidence was drawing ever tighter, and I sensed that Holmes was preparing to spring the trap that would finally expose the elaborate deception that had cost Archibald Pelling his life. The systematic theft of materials from both the publishing house and Miss Vale's lodgings had transformed our investigation into something far more urgent and complex. Holmes stood before the gas fire in Mr. Cross's office, his sharp profile etched against the flickering light as he contemplated the evolving pattern of criminal behavior that lay before us. "The beauty of this conspiracy," Holmes began, his voice carrying that note of intellectual appreciation which he reserved for the most sophisticated criminal minds, "lies not merely in its initial deception, but in its capacity for adaptation. Our adversary has moved beyond the simple staging of Mr. Pelling's death to a comprehensive campaign of narrative control. The theft of the electrotype plates, the compositor's records, and the advance proofs represents a calculated effort to manufacture evidence that will permanently discredit Miss Vale while establishing an unassailable official version of events." He turned to address our assembled company with that quiet authority which commanded absolute attention. "Consider the implications, gentlemen. With authentic printing plates bearing the house crest, our criminal can produce documents that will pass the most rigorous examination. The compositor's records provide the framework for establishing false timelines and authentication. Most significantly, the stolen proofs of the public statement denouncing Miss Vale's materials can be modified and published without Mr. Pelling's final approval. approval that would never have been granted given his change of heart regarding the memoir project. Harold Quince, who had grown increasingly pale during this exposition, now stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Holmes, I fear the situation is more complex than I initially revealed. For the past 3 weeks, I have been conducting my own investigation into what I believe to be a conspiracy against Mr. Pelling. I discovered evidence that someone with intimate knowledge of our affairs was systematically copying private correspondence and business records." Holmes's grey eyes sharpened with interest. "Your photographic skills proved useful in this surveillance?" "Indeed, sir. I created copies of everything I could access, hoping to preserve evidence should anything happen to Mr. Pelling. When I learned of his death and the circumstances surrounding that final document, I realized my worst fears had been realized." Quince's scholarly composure was beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated guilt and anxiety. "I have been afraid to reveal this information, knowing that my chemical knowledge and access to Mr. Pelling's private affairs could easily be construed as evidence of guilt rather than protective intent." "Your caution was understandable, Mr. Quince, though perhaps misguided," Holmes replied with characteristic precision. "However, your documentation may prove invaluable in exposing the true architect of this deception." He moved to examine the violated safe once more, his keen eyes noting details that had escaped earlier observation. "The professional skill demonstrated in this break-in suggests someone with considerable experience in such matters or access to such expertise. At this crucial moment, Mrs. Broach appeared with news that sent a ripple of tension through our small assembly. "Mr. Holmes, Master Lionel has departed the house with a travelling bag, claiming urgent business that cannot wait. The footman observed him burning papers in the courtyard before his departure, and he appeared most agitated when questioned about his destination." Holmes was already moving toward his coat with that explosive energy which marked the critical moments of his investigations. "The trap closes of its own accord, Watson. Our adversary has recognized that systematic deception cannot indefinitely withstand systematic analysis." He turned to Lestrade with decisive authority. "Inspector, I require immediate surveillance of all departure points from London. If Mr. Lionel Pelling attempts to leave the country, he must be detained for questioning." "Furthermore," Holmes continued, his mind working with that remarkable speed which characterized his most brilliant moments, "we shall employ the very instruments of deception that have been stolen against their thief. Mr. Cross, you will prepare an announcement indicating that Pelling and Cross intends to proceed immediately with publication of additional materials related to the memoir controversy, materials that will, we shall hint, cast the entire affair in a dramatically different light." The publisher nodded with growing understanding. "You wish to draw the criminal back to attempt further manipulation of the evidence?" "Precisely. Our adversary has invested too much in controlling this narrative to allow new revelations to proceed unchallenged. They will be compelled to act, either to destroy the supposed new evidence or to ensure its content serves their purposes." Holmes's eyes took on that steely quality which I had learned to associate with the final phases of his most complex cases. "When they do, we shall be waiting with the complete truth of Mr. Archibald Pelling's murder and the elaborate web of deception that has been woven around his death." As we prepared to leave Fleet Street, I could sense that the endgame was rapidly approaching. The morning's revelations had transformed our investigation from a scientific curiosity about undrying ink into a comprehensive understanding of calculated murder disguised as natural death. The trap was set, the players positioned, and I felt certain that before many more hours had passed, the complete truth would be revealed in all its tragic complexity. The trap Holmes had so carefully constructed began to close with the methodical precision that marked all his most brilliant investigations. By evening, our strategic announcement had achieved its intended effect, rippling through the interconnected networks of London's publishing and political circles with the inexorable force of a stone cast into still water. The hint of new evidence, the suggestion of revelations that would cast the entire Pelling affair in a dramatically different light, had created exactly the sort of narrative threat that could not be ignored by those who had invested so heavily in controlling the story. Holmes positioned himself in Mr. Cross's office as the gas lamps flickered to life throughout Fleet Street, his sharp profile etched against the window as he observed the evening's pedestrian traffic, with that characteristic intensity which indicated his remarkable mind was calculating the final moves of a complex game. The sealed packet, ostensibly containing the promised revelations, rested conspicuously upon the publisher's desk, while Holmes had arranged for subtle but observable security measures that would suggest both the importance of the contents and the vulnerability of their current protection. Our adversary has demonstrated remarkable sophistication in chemical deception and document manipulation, Holmes observed to me as we settled into our concealed positions. Such skills require not merely theoretical knowledge but extensive practical experience gained through careful experimentation. The basement darkroom of this establishment would provide an ideal laboratory for such work, combining privacy with access to the necessary materials and equipment. Indeed, Holmes had discovered through careful inquiry that Harold Quince had been granted after-hours access to the building's photographic facilities for what he claimed were personal projects related to his scholarly interests. The combination of chemical knowledge, intimate familiarity with Mr. Pelling's affairs, and unrestricted access to the tools of deception had created the perfect conditions for the elaborate crime we had been investigating. As the evening deepened, our vigil was rewarded by the soft sound of a key turning in the building's rear entrance. Holmes's hand rose in silent warning as footsteps approached through the corridors below, moving with the confident familiarity of someone who knew the building's layout intimately. The intruder paused at intervals, clearly listening for any signs of unexpected occupancy before proceeding toward the basement levels where the darkroom facilities were located. Holmes had anticipated this approach, and we descended by way of the main staircase with the silent precision of experienced hunters, positioning ourselves where we could observe the darkroom's entrance while remaining concealed behind the substantial machinery of the printing press. The red glow that soon emanated from beneath the darkroom door confirmed that our quarry had indeed taken the bait and was now engaged in examining what he believed to be the threatening new evidence. When Holmes finally gave the signal, and we emerged from concealment with Lestrade and his constables, we discovered Harold Quince bent over a work table laden with the instruments of his deception. The sealed packet had been opened with surgical precision, its contents spread out for examination under the darkroom's specialized lighting. More significantly, the table also held an array of chemical apparatus that immediately explained the mystery of the undrying ink that had first drawn our attention to this case. "Mr. Quince," Holmes announced with that quiet authority which commanded absolute attention, "your expertise in photographic chemistry has served you well in creating the illusion of Mr. Pelling's final confession. The glycerin solution, the precise timing of its application, the careful preparation of the writing surface, all demonstrate a mastery of chemical principles that few could achieve." Quince straightened slowly, his scholarly features bearing an expression of resignation rather than surprise. In his hands he held a small glass bottle containing a clear solution, while scattered across the work surface were various implements that testified to his systematic approach to document manipulation. "You have been remarkably thorough, Mr. Holmes," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weariness of a man whose carefully constructed deceptions had finally been exposed. "The beauty of your scheme," Holmes continued, his grey eyes taking on that steely quality which marked the crystallization of his complete understanding, lay not merely in its chemical sophistication, but in its psychological cunning. By creating a confession that appeared to be written at the moment of death, you sought to establish both motive and timeline while simultaneously discrediting Miss Vale's materials and providing a convenient explanation for Mr. Pelling's demise. The evidence surrounding Quince told the complete story of his criminal enterprise. Photographic plates showing various stages of handwriting practice, chemical formulations for preventing ink from drying naturally, and most damning of all, detailed notes outlining the precise timing and methodology required to administer prussic acid through a fountain pen while creating the illusion of natural death. Furthermore, Holmes observed, examining the apparatus with professional interest, your position as Mr. Pelling's trusted assistant provided you with intimate knowledge of his habits, access to his private correspondence, and the ability to manipulate both household routines and business affairs without arousing suspicion. The locked room was achieved through simple mechanical means, while the false correspondence from Mr. Clay provided additional misdirection to confuse the official investigation. As Lestrade applied the handcuffs, Quince's composure finally began to crack under the weight of his exposure. "I thought I could control the narrative," he admitted, his scholarly precision giving way to obvious distress. Mr. Pelling's decision to abandon the memoir would have destroyed everything I had worked to achieve. The political revelations contained in those medical records represented far more than mere publishing profits. They held the power to reshape public understanding of recent governmental decisions. The confession that followed revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that had cost Archibald Pelling his life. Quince had indeed been the architect of the chemical deceptions and the practical executor of the murder, but his motivations extended far beyond simple financial gain. The memoir's political implications had attracted the attention of parties who were willing to pay handsomely for its suppression, and Quince had seen an opportunity to serve both his scholarly ambitions and his financial needs through one carefully orchestrated crime. As we prepared to leave the scene of Quince's final defeat, Holmes paused to examine once more the ingenious apparatus that had created the mystery of the undrying ink. The criminal mind, Watson, often displays remarkable creativity when applied to deception, though it invariably fails to account for the inexorable power of systematic investigation. Mr. Quince's expertise served him well in creating his chemical illusions, but no amount of scientific knowledge can ultimately conceal the fundamental patterns that connect cause to effect in human behavior. The case of the ink that wouldn't dry had revealed itself to be far more than a simple curiosity of chemistry. It had exposed a murder of extraordinary sophistication, motivated by the dangerous intersection of political secrets and personal ambition. As we returned to Baker Street in the gathering darkness, I reflected that Holmes had once again demonstrated his unparalleled ability to perceive the hidden connections that bind together the most complex criminal conspiracies, transforming apparent impossibility into inevitable logic through the application of pure analytical reasoning. The following morning found us ensconced once more in the familiar comfort of our Baker Street sitting room, the fog having finally lifted to reveal a crisp, clear November sky that seemed to mirror the clarity with which the truth had finally emerged. The aroma of Mrs. Hudson's excellent coffee mingled with the faint scent of tobacco from Holmes's pipe, while the morning papers lay scattered about, their headlines proclaiming in sensational terms the arrest of Harold Quince and the exposure of what the Times had termed a conspiracy of remarkable sophistication involving murder, forgery, and political manipulation. Holmes sat before the fire with that expression of quiet satisfaction which invariably followed the successful resolution of a particularly challenging case, his long fingers steepled as he contemplated the intricate web of deception we had so methodically unravelled. Miss Eleanor Vale had called earlier to express her profound gratitude and to confirm that her father's medical records would now receive the serious historical consideration they deserved, free from the cloud of fraudulent accusations that Quince's elaborate scheme had sought to create. "The case, Watson, ultimately revolved around the simplest of principles," Holmes began, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he organized his thoughts with characteristic precision. "The laws of chemistry, like the laws of human nature, are immutable, and when they appear to be defied, it is invariably due to human intervention rather than supernatural caprice. Quince, a man of considerable intellect and specialized scientific training, found himself in the unique position of possessing both the knowledge and the opportunity to create what appeared to be an impossible crime. I settled into my chair with evident interest, still marveling at the complexity of the conspiracy that had been so systematically exposed. His expertise in photographic chemistry provided him with capabilities that would have seemed almost magical to the average observer. "Precisely, Watson. The glycerin solution, applied as an invisible humectant to the paper's surface, prevented the natural drying of ink indefinitely. This created the crucial illusion that Mr. Pelling had written his confession at the very moment of his death, when in fact the document had been prepared well in advance." Holmes reached for his pipe, that familiar gesture indicating his mind was still working through the final implications of our investigation. The beauty of his deception lay not merely in its chemical sophistication, but in its psychological cunning. The revelation of Quince's complete confession had exposed the full scope of his criminal enterprise. His position as Pelling's trusted assistant had provided him with intimate knowledge of the publisher's habits and unrestricted access to his private affairs, while his scholarly background had given him the technical expertise necessary to create the elaborate deceptions that had initially baffled our investigation. More significantly, his connections within certain political circles had made him aware of the substantial financial rewards available for suppressing the controversial memoir. Quince was initially hired merely to steal the materials and discredit Miss Vale's father's records, Holmes continued, his voice carrying that note of analytical satisfaction which marked the complete understanding of complex criminal behavior. However, Mr. Pelling's sudden change of heart, his decision to abandon the project entirely and return the medical documents, presented an unforeseen obstacle that required more drastic measures. "The murder was planned as a natural death, with a convenient confession," I observed, "following the logical progression of events. Indeed, the prussic acid, administered through the fountain pen itself, would cause swift death while leaving minimal trace. The victim, in the act of writing, would unknowingly ingest the poison through contact with the contaminated nib. The locked room was achieved through elementary mechanical means. A silk thread passed beneath the door to manipulate the key from the corridor." Holmes paused, examining the chemical apparatus that Lestrade had permitted us to retain for further study. Every aspect of the crime demonstrated meticulous planning and scientific precision. The systematic nature of Quince's deception had been remarkable in its attention to detail. The false confession had been prepared weeks in advance, with the chemical treatment of the paper perfected through extensive experimentation in the darkroom facilities. Even the forged correspondence from Mr. Clay had been designed to create additional confusion and misdirection, while Lionel Pelling's apparent guilt had been carefully orchestrated through the manipulation of evidence and the exploitation of his known weaknesses. Young Pelling's role was that of an unwitting accomplice, Holmes reflected, his expression growing more serious. He returned early from his evening out, discovered the forged letter, and witnessed enough to understand that something irregular was occurring. His removal of the correspondence and his false testimony about hearing his uncle working late were the desperate actions of a frightened man who feared he would be blamed for circumstances beyond his understanding. Lionel had been apprehended at Dover, attempting to flee the country with what remained of his modest inheritance. His interrogation had revealed the extent to which Quince had manipulated his perceptions and encouraged his panic, convincing him that he would inevitably be suspected regardless of his innocence. The young man's testimony had provided crucial corroboration of the timeline while exposing the psychological manipulation that had made him an unwilling participant in his uncle's destruction. The subsequent burglaries of both the publishing house and Miss Vale's lodgings represented Quince's increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative, Holmes observed, rising to examine the morning light streaming through our windows. The stolen electrotype plates and compositors' records were intended to manufacture additional false documents, while the search of Miss Vale's materials was designed to destroy any remaining evidence that might contradict his fabricated confession. And what of the political interests who sought to suppress the memoir? I inquired, curious about the broader implications of our investigation. Holmes smiled with evident satisfaction. Quince's correspondence, discovered during the search of his lodgings, has provided Scotland Yard with detailed information about the network of individuals who were prepared to pay substantial sums for the memoir's suppression. While justice may proceed slowly in such matters, I am confident that the wheels of investigation will continue to turn. Miss Vale has decided to proceed with publication under different auspices, viewing it as a matter of historical integrity to complete the work that cost Mr. Pelling his life. As the morning progressed and London awakened to another day of ordinary concerns, I reflected upon the extraordinary events that had brought us to this peaceful resolution. The case of the ink that wouldn't dry had revealed itself to be far more than a simple curiosity of chemistry. It had exposed a murder of remarkable sophistication, motivated by the dangerous intersection of political secrets, scholarly ambition, and financial desperation. The criminal mind, Watson, Holmes concluded, settling back into his chair with that expression of intellectual contentment which marked the successful conclusion of a worthy challenge, invariably reveals itself through patterns of behavior that logical analysis can detect and systematic investigation can expose. Mr. Quince's expertise served him well in creating his chemical illusions, but no amount of scientific knowledge can ultimately conceal the fundamental connections between motive, method, and opportunity that govern all human action. The fire crackled peacefully in the grate, and the familiar sounds of Mrs. Hudson's domestic activities could be heard from below. The extraordinary had once again been reduced to the ordinary through the application of Holmes's remarkable analytical abilities, and I felt that familiar sense of satisfaction that came from witnessing justice served through the triumph of reason over deception. As I prepared to record the complete details of our investigation for posterity, Holmes had already turned his attention to a telegram from Cornwall concerning a rather curious matter involving a vanishing fisherman. "The game, Watson," he observed, with characteristic understatement, "is perpetually afoot.